United South Broadway Corporation, promoting community building, youth development, fair housing, and fair lending in New Mexico since 1986. We work with community advocates in 6 key areas: fair housing and fair lending, crime prevention, financial literacy, locally based commercial development, and opportunities for youth. USBC offers free HUD-certified housing, counseling, and legal services to homeowners statewide facing mortgage delinquency or foreclosure. And we offer anti-racism trainings for policymakers. Welcome to United South Broadway Corporation.
Hi, I'm Debbie Norman with United South Broadway Corporation, and with me is Diana Dorn-Jones, our Executive Director. And people often ask us what we do and how we got started. And Diana has been here since the very beginning, and so she's going to be able to tell us about the history of the organization and what our main focus, housing, and how that's evolved over the years. So Diana, can you tell us a little bit about the early days of United South Broadway and the Peace in the Streets campaign and those things?
Well, I'm probably one of the earlier people, but there was at least 2 directors before me with very short terms. This organization was started by neighborhood people, my parents being one of them, my mother. They were looking for a way to address housing in this neighborhood, affordable housing, because there was a lot of real estate contracts taking place and a lot of abuses that go with that. And so they thought this just can't continue to happen. And so they worked with the city of Albuquerque and with HUD and came up with a program to do loan guarantees so that people that wanted to buy a home and stabilize the neighborhood through home ownership would have that opportunity. They could buy a house, and then the city would provide a subsidy to bring the house into affordability, and thereby bringing about home ownership, increasing the home ownership levels in neighborhoods like South Broadway. And of course, over the years, this program began to expand because any good idea should, if it's good for South Broadway, it should be good for some of the surrounding neighborhoods like Santa Barbara, Martinez Town, and others. So we began to work in that regard to do the same kind of programming in other neighborhoods, because the idea was to stabilize these old neighborhoods and give opportunities for future generations to stay in the neighborhoods and not leave the neighborhood.
Okay, well, that's history that I didn't even know, so I'm glad I'm sitting here learning it from you, Diana. So
the Peace in the Street campaign is what you ask about as well. And I think that just goes to the fact that United South Broadway is a community development organization. But of course, over 30 plus years, we've evolved into being a civil legal service organization and to doing many other things. But we could still have that mentality and the culture of a community organization that's active in the neighborhood in which it lives. And even though we're statewide around our work today, we always keep a local focus around the historic neighborhoods in the downtown core, because that's where we started. And that's kind of the heart of the organization. And we feel like it's important to be in the role of advocacy and providing resources to neighborhood people. So in the Peace in the Street, I'm a resident of South Broadway. I was born and raised in this neighborhood. So it's not unusual for us to try to do something like that. Peace in the Street campaign came about because people were coming in and out of our neighborhood, doing drugs. It was in the heyday of the drug trade, not just in South Broadway and not just in Albuquerque, New Mexico. This was going on across the country. But we felt like we had to create a safer space for children to grow up and for elderly people to enjoy their years of retirement as they were living in the neighborhood. There was a lot of gun violence. We found that there were people coming into our neighborhood from other parts of the country. Easy access, because we're right off an interstate. And so big trucks were coming in and bringing drugs, purchasing drugs. And it was not really a safe thing. So our neighborhood association, of which I was a member at the time, we got together and we said, I guess our mantra was kind of like Fannie Lou Hamer. We're sick and tired of being sick and tired, because everybody was complaining all the time. We said, we can't continue to do this. And it was getting more and more dangerous. And so we just decided we've got to be vocal. We've got to stand up and take a position. And so Peace in the Street came about through actually weekly marches in our streets. Every Friday, 6 o'clock. We come home from work, we change our clothes, we put on our tennis shoes, get our shakers and our bullhorns, and meet our neighbors at a designated place. We'd always start, because this is a community of faith historically, we'd always have be met with by either a priest or a minister, and we'd start with prayer, and then we'd walk up and down the street behind a banner saying, Somos vecinos, we are neighbors, so that we could send out a message that this is not a neighborhood that's going to tolerate that kind of behavior. And so we kind of laid the groundwork for this work in Albuquerque and beyond. And so it was also kind of looking at taking license plates. We had a strategy. We would actually work with license plates, get license plates, and write letters to people saying, your car has been seen in our neighborhood, engaging in what appears to be illegal activity. Check the box, which one? We would check the box. And we would send letters and just say, this is not acceptable behavior. And we ask that you cease and desist from this behavior in our neighborhood.
Did you get people responding to that?
Lots. Because what we also would do, when things look suspicious, we had people that we put eyes and ears, because there's a role for everybody in that kind of advocacy. We stopped children from marching with us because it became too dangerous for children to be a part of that march. But there were things they could do. They could do posters, they could do signage that we would do when we had little rallies. Elderly people, we didn't want them doing that either. But they're home all day and they see everything. So we had a hot spot sheet. So they would mark anything that looked irregular. And we worked with local police department. Now that's kind of unusual for neighborhoods like ours to have a relationship with the police department. But we said, we're going to take you on a path of neighborhood literacy, how you conduct yourselves in neighborhoods like ours. And it was a long-term process. But in the end, our neighborhood won National Neighborhood of the Year across all categories, competing with neighborhoods all across the country. We went to Pasadena to get the award. And so we competed against everybody. We won every award. And the big thing about it that I can say it was solidifies a relationship is that our chief of police sent our area commander with us.
Oh, that's wonderful.
He accompanied us to that.
Accept
so
the
people
award.
were kind of like, this is interesting, you know?
Right.
But you have to go on a journey of trust and re-education of how police do business in your neighborhood. Serve and protect is what your car says. And that's what we expect. And we'll work together to do that. So I was telling someone the other day, we would meet with Captain Widener, and we tell him how his officers may be conducting themselves in our meeting, the kind of language they were using, and say, that's not acceptable, Captain Widener. He would take it all down. He'd burn up the piece of paper that the note was written on, wanting to instill trust in us about what we were telling him. So it was a really unique relationship. So we still have that going on. That we're not that was some 30 years ago, right? Right. We're not perfect. We also put in place something, because we stepped back and said, now how did our neighborhood get that way? What happened? Well, we realized that the broken window syndrome was going on, and that was crime prevention through environmental design. If you don't fix your neighborhood up, if you don't have a sense of welcome and statements to say, when you drive through an area, somebody lives here. And so when you visit someone's home, you begin to respect that space when you know they live there. So we begin to put signage in our neighborhood that says, welcoming you to South Broadway. We begin to put art by working with the School of Architecture and Planning, the City of Albuquerque, 1% for Public Arts, to do bus stops and to do alley closures that were decorative. And we brought the whole neighborhood into that design process. Children, elderly people, so that we have a symbol that people can look at and say, recognize and say, this neighborhood belongs to some people. And so when I enter this space, they have an expectation as to how I will conduct myself. And that's exactly what we have.
Setting expectations and a feeling of this is a neighborhood, this is a community, and these are people.
And we have a sense of ownership of it.
Yes, right.
So that's kind of what, and so it was so funny because we started this whole thing was just working on we had a problem with a pothole in our neighborhood. When I came into the neighborhood coming back from Los Angeles, I came back and saying, well, housing, we got to fix this neighborhood up. We got to do this, we got to do that. And it was like people sitting stare at me at a meeting. And then I went home and I told my dad, who was one of the first neighborhood people and the first president for the neighborhood association. And I said, Dad, they just, he said, well, what else do they want to do? I said, well, they keep talking about that pothole over on Walter. He said, go fix the damn pothole. Okay. So it's like, okay. So we organized around that. We organized and trained ourselves and others. We went and looked at the pothole. We got sand out of the pothole. We put it in bags. We sent it to other places. What kind of material? Because the elders were telling us, They fill that thing every 3 months, but it just keeps coming back. So that tells us something wrong with the material you're using. So we begin to educate, write letters to all the appropriate agencies in the city of Albuquerque and others, and we begin to put ourselves into a position that we expect certain services. There's an expectation in our neighborhood now that you will do certain things in our neighborhood. So we organize though around that. So we went from filling a pothole to fighting crime, okay? 0 to 60.
60. Well, they're related.
Exactly.
It sounds like
exactly.
from what you said.
But
you
it just
know, the
tells you
broken
that you
window
can
syndrome.
organize around the smallest of things. It's just about bringing people together and having a common understanding about what it means to each of us. That we all have a stake in it.
Right, that
Sense
sense
of
of
neighborhood.
community, neighborhood.
Right.
Right. So that seems to be a common theme that came up and went through the Back to Broadway movement.
Yeah, because I think the other thing is that we noticed is that we needed to create spaces to keep our children here as they were growing up and going to college, and we didn't want them to leave the neighborhood. And we also wanted elderly people to be able to live. And so when you do housing development, the biggest, the most expensive thing is land. That drives the cost of housing, how much you pay for that parcel. And so we said, there's a lot of vacant land in our neighborhood, vacant lots. And we got that understanding by looking at our crime prevention work, because bad things can happen on vacant lots, and we began to document those lots. And so at some point, we got in a relationship with the city of Albuquerque and the School of Architecture and Planning. And we began to work at University of New Mexico, and we began to work with them to, the planning department, for one, is to help us identify every vacant lot in our neighborhood, 3 neighborhoods, South Broadway, Bud Ellis, as well as San Jose. So we wanted to see what kind of vacant lot inventory do we have in our neighborhood. Then we wanted to look and see, are those lots developable? Do they have utilities on them? Was a house there before that if you could develop a house there without a lot of expense because the utilities are already running in there? Or is it an environmental hazard? Have there been dumping going on? What's going on? Tell us about this lot. And we did that so that we would know, but we also wanted to, at some point, invite developers into our neighborhood to do housing development. And the reason most big developers don't come into neighborhoods like ours is because they don't have time to go around and looking for lots. They go out on the west side and buy big parcels of land and it's cost, you know. But if they have a navigator within the neighborhood that can identify those and become co-developer with the builder and the architect, then we can be the ones that usher you in. We can give you the portfolio of those lots. You can pick them, and we can work together. The other thing that we did with the University of New Mexico is that we also said the kind of housing that comes into our neighborhood is important. What it looks like in terms of, does it fit in? Now, South Broadway is really unique because, and a lot of these neighborhoods, because we have a variation of housing, and that's what makes it interesting. We have old Victorians, we have, you know, adobes, we have all kinds of things. But we wanted to look at the kind of housing that is expandable, can shrink and grow as a family does. And so, and we also talked to neighbors. We did some convenings. I think it's really important to call the neighbors together. So what do you like about this? What kind of house would you want? How does it have to fit? Well, we found out that nobody wanted a garages in front. We didn't want a west side house because when you have a garage in front, you don't visit with your neighbors. We use our front yards to talk across the fence to each other. We use our backyard. We don't want a garage where you drive in, you don't see your neighbor because you get out of your car inside the garage. And, you know, maybe at most you meet your neighbor when you're going to the mailbox, maybe, you know, and you just wave, but you don't build a sense of neighborhood. And so and they wanted garages for storage because people have a lot of storage outside. Well, it's because we don't give them storage elsewhere. So so all of those things came into the design guidelines discussion between the 3 neighborhoods in the School of Architecture and Planning. And then we went to the city and said, okay, we've got design guidelines for housing. We've identified lots. Let's do a pilot project, Back to Broadway. And so we not only did we put in, I think we did 7, we tested those single family housing plans out with 7 houses that were scattered in the neighborhood on vacant lots. So we bought them and developed them. And we worked with a major builder, and a major architect, because we wanted to also demonstrate if you do this, you can draw those kind of developers in So we had Sivage Homes, who's not here anymore, but they were a big builder. And Sivage Homes did those properties for the houses, a single family. And then, of course, we did the Broadway Vistas. That was a great, everybody was pushing us to put high density in our neighborhood. Well, that's kind of like, we don't really want high density. We kind of like the way we're spread out a little bit, but we know there's a need to do something on vacant lot. That was a piece of land that was owned by a person who lived in another neighborhood in the downtown core. And she was able to sell it to us for a good price. And we held on to it for a long time. And it was vacant for over 30 some years. So when we got ready to do something, we thought, well, nobody likes it the way it is now, but what would they do if we just plop something on there? We said, we need to start talking to people. So I believe that you have to bring in architects and planners into your organization to do those kinds of things and help move that kind of movement, help to make it happen. Plans and convenings and facilitated meetings. And so we worked very closely with the planning department. And so we walked the streets and we told people, we bought this and here's what we're thinking. Are you interested? We convened several neighborhood meetings with people that were directly impacted by that lot. And so we came up with, okay, we can justify building these housing units, condos, because it's on a traffic corridor on Broadway. It's near a bus stop. And so it's not coming into the heart of the residential area. It's not going to be towering over houses and looking into people's backyards. So we tested it, it worked. And so moving on to the next thing.
and it involved the community and the planners and the architects. There was community engagement all along.
I think what neighborhoods make mistakes, like our, older historic neighborhoods are always on the cutting edge of trying to do things and preserve themselves, that you have to go and look for the experts and bring them into your organizations and bring them into community. Because often, people say, oh yeah, you're working with planning department. Well, planning department, we worked with the School of Architecture. We wanted them to understand that there's a role for architecture in old historic neighborhoods. Poor people need artwork too in our neighborhoods. We want it, we value it, we produce it, and often don't get benefits from it. And so that was just a way of, I think that's one of the things that I was able to bring to the organization as being a former banker, a corporate banker, is that we can't get anything done on our own. We have to open up our doors to some degree to bring others in, but at the same time, we have to learn to be good clients, because it doesn't matter who you contract with. If you're not a good client, you won't get what you want. And so we learned the skill of being good clients and also overseeing contracts of what's supposed to be done. So we kind of became better stewards of our neighborhood.
So you were, talking about the planners and developers need to have neighborhood literacy, and the neighborhood needs to have client literacy.
Exactly.
And
look where we sit. We sit in the heart of downtown in these old historic neighborhoods. The University of New Mexico, quite frankly, sits in these neighborhoods. So we look up that shining building on the hill that all of us pay taxes on. What does it do for us? What does it contribute to neighborhoods like ours? And so we said, we're going to tap that door and talk about what resources are supposed to be there.
Right. Well, this is very interesting to me, because now I'm getting a history lesson. I just sit in my little office and do what I'm told.
Do lots of stuff.
Yeah, well. So housing, you've always said that your mother's a houser. USBC is about housing, fair housing, equitable housing. So what else? I know USBC has done home buyer education. We've done a number of things.
We've done first-time home buyer years ago, because that was also part of that. As you put housing in the neighborhood, you want to get people qualified for it. And using our banking background, I'm not the only one in our building, in our office, that had that kind of mortgage background. Our housing counselor was an underwriter. And so she knew how to do packaging of loans. And so we were able to do that, get applications in, work with a local lender, get a line of credit with them to help finance that, and also to get subsidies for homeowners to bring that house down to a range of affordable monthly payments. So we did that, but owning a house comes with responsibilities. And so we were the first ones that did a hands-on home repair program, We actually were using the old Habitat building, which we own now, right,
Okay.
and have school in. But we actually use that facility to train those first-time home buyers on how to do basic home repairs. Because if you have to call someone right away all the time, it's not going to be affordable anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So it was important to put those skills in place for homeowners.
Right. Yeah, we still get a lot of calls for people needing help with home repair. Absolutely. What about fair housing enforcement? I'm leaping ahead a little bit over a few years, but we've gotten involved with that.
Well, because it's about justice and what's right and what's equitable. It's also about long-term affordability, because fair housing is really an important thing, and I think we were already probably doing our anti-racism work around that time at the same time. Mm-hmm. And so because we're entrenched in that aspect of housing, because housing is one of the most racialized things in America, where you live, who you live next to, we thought it was important to also look at how do we keep people in housing and not being pushed out through unfair practices around fair housing violations. And so we felt that was an important thing for us to learn as a staff, but also to be able to implement that on behalf of people in this community who are experiencing that. A place to go, a place to make your complaint, a place to work with others who may be doing this work. And we also have national associations. So early on, we worked with the Urban Institute, and mm-hmm. we had a wonderful housing counselor. She's passed on now, Nita Luna Davis, who mm-hmm. just fabulous woman, and she had a history in that. And so when Nita wasn't working, I found her, and we found each other and said, "Come on, we got work to do." And so she did that testing. She trained testers. She put them out on the streets to do testing for rental as well as home ownership. And then we joined the National Fair Housing Alliance, and we've been part of that ever since. Where I'm hoping that that's something that we can develop, because New Mexico really needs a fair housing group. And I think we're probably poised to do that. So to me, that's one of the things I still aspire to put in place, that our organization will address those issues for the state of New Mexico and for homeowners, so that we can address those abuses that can take place. And when you have such a tight housing stock that we do right now, where there's so few houses on the market and rents are escalating, people are going to be more and more subjected to those kinds of issues, and we certainly need to have a place to keep that in check and have it reported.
So Diana, I wanted to ask you about the Mainstreet program and the facade improvement work that USBC has done.
Yeah, so we're of the mind that you cannot just do housing. You have to have, if you really want to build a neighborhood and build wealth in a neighborhood, there have to be opportunities for people to spend their money. Poor neighborhoods, I guess you could say they're economically poor, but they do bring money in. The question is, where do they spend their money? And so when I grew up here, we had a drugstore on the corner, we had laundromats, we had dry cleaners and bakeries and florist shops and dry goods stores, that kind of thing. And so in South Broadway, we have, in these old neighborhoods, there are some true commercial corridors, like South Broadway, 4th Street, there's Mountain Road. There are true corridors for business. And so we wanted to really take a look at that and see, how do we bring those resources back to our neighborhood, support those that have stayed long-term and struggling to stay in place and haven't had a chance to make investment in the fiscal structure of their buildings, so they're not as attractive maybe on the outside as they'd like them to be. So we began to look at what kind of strategies might be in place. We knew we needed to when you bring families in and you bring housing, you need to bring those other services in as well.
Right.
And so we began to look at strategies, and how do you do that? Well, New Mexico Mainstreet was one. But New Mexico Mainstreet gives you kind of an orientation towards how to support businesses, how to do marketing, but it really comes with no money, per se. So we thought, business people are very busy, they're small business. I kind of feel like, is there something in it for them to work with us, to be a part of this? And so we said, we've got to figure out how we make some incentive and put an incentive in place. And so we went to the city of Albuquerque, and we were able to get facade improvement money through the old UDAG grant. They had put some RFPs out, request for proposals, and we applied for facade improvements. And so I hired an architect. She later she moved into the neighborhood, is fact. And we began to go up and down the streets. And what's so good about Cindy Lopez, Cindy was an old time architect, even though she was young, but she could draw. She didn't do AutoCAD on everything. So nothing's better than to go door to door with merchants that you're working with. We created a program that they could borrow so much, and we could actually give a grant for so much for people who couldn't afford anything. But we'd also would leverage, if you put private money, we would leverage up to a certain amount of public dollars. And in the end, I think we leveraged well over $600,000 of private investment. So it was well over a couple of $1 million of money that we put out in the neighborhoods. It started in South Broadway, South 4th Street. We began to look at the businesses, how to give them marketing support, and how to do facade improvements. So when Cindy would go out, she'd take her sketch pad with her and sit down with the business owner and begin to draw and show them. And they said, well, and they get ownership in that drawing. And then we would provide them with the money and the construction support. We hired contractors to work with us and the businesses to actually put in place awnings, painting, signage, all of those things that are important for retail and to get people in your door. That program expanded from South Broadway to 4th Street to Mountain Road to Central. The Huning Highland neighborhood is Central. And then we began to do East Central programming because we came pretty good at signage, and we wanted to preserve, as part of Mainstreet, we wanted to preserve all the old neon signs on Route 66. And so we began to take a look at that, and we began to do signage in those commercial areas as well. It just became something that it just brought the whole community together, because the downtown core is, yes, it's these old neighborhoods. But if you go to, going West Central, you'll see a lot of those old hotels and things. And we did some in the south part of Central as well. So we began again to just build an expertise on how to do facade improvements. And we won a lot of awards in the Mainstreet program for doing that. Mainstreet saw the they have a program that you can put in place, but you've got to have resources tied to it. It's got to be capital money tied to it. And so those main streets around the country that are the most productive have found out a way to bring a financial resource as well.
Just like you did with the facade improvement,
right.
That type of money.
Right, exactly. And Mainstreet is kind of the umbrella that keeps those meetings going with the merchants, having discussions and going and just kind of working together around marketing and outreach as well. So we do campaigns and things like that to promote their businesses.
So this is all about neighborhood stabilization, the commercial part, the residential part, the homeowner part, the public spaces, preventing crime, everything.
Yeah, and it's about closing the generational wealth gap, having people be able to age in place and not be displaced by improvements that take place, because our biggest challenge when we do work, groups like United South Broadway that do community work like this, our biggest challenge is to make sure that we don't price out the historic residents. There's that tipping point that you have to always keep your eye on. Mm-hmm. And so we're always having to balance that, gentrification versus keeping a space for people who have lived here historically, an affordable space, and the preservation of the culture.
Right.
That's as important as anything else. How we do things, how we engage with each other. So we always want to keep an eye to making sure those pieces are in place and strong enough to withstand other people coming in. We want you to join in. We don't want you to come in and try to destroy that. You want to build on it, we're good.
Yeah.
But this is our bedrock.
Or not displace.
That's right.
Move out.
That's right.
Well, that's really interesting. And that kind of brings up the fact that United South Broadway has been involved in youth development since its inception too. That's kind of a key part of keeping neighborhoods stable, and so
affordable housing, small business development, and youth development have been
Yes.
key pillars for us. Well, you can't leave the children out. That's our future generation. That's who's going to run this neighborhood when we're not here anymore. And so we have to make an investment in them. So, and I believe that you start on the early side, and I've kind of looked at education and been a part of we had an after school program. We worked with the University of New Mexico to do the original community schools network that's still in business today in Albuquerque. But we started that in these neighborhoods. Myself, Dr. Michael Morris from the University of New Mexico, and Dr. Ira Harkavy from the University of Pennsylvania, the Netter Center. He was a partner. He had 2 partners in the Southwest. One was in Colorado and one in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And we were that group. And we were really, the whole effort was really about community schools kind of thinking, university partnerships with the community. It's like I said earlier about having a university sitting in old historic neighborhoods, but not contributing. Well, University of Pennsylvania was the same way. West Philadelphia, So that's where it was. And they felt and knew that in order for them to survive as a university, they have to go beyond the walls of the university into those communities and take those resources out there. And so Dr. Harkavy had a grant through Reader's Digest that he was putting out so that started our after school program. We started it with that. And we that's when we created our community garden. We had the first community garden in Albuquerque. It was just a residential lot, and it was vacant, and we began to do a community school, a lot work, growing food for the neighborhood for one, and just actually trying to bring our children in touch with the earth. And, so our after school program kind of evolved into the Youth Conservation Corps, where there was a Senator Romero that told me, you really ought to do this. He had told me that many years ago, but we weren't ready. But at some point we became ready. He said, what were you talking to us about? Yeah. We're ready for that now. And so we began to hire young people age 14 through, I think I went up to 19, 20, maybe a little less, because I don't think 14-year-olds ought to be working around with older people like that, because they're young. And so we would go 14 to like 17 in high school.
Right, a
giving
good
them,
age cohort.
Yeah, and then giving them opportunities to go into the Bosques. We were called the Bosque Youth Conservation Corps. Those projects are funded by the state of New Mexico. And we went in and our kids needed income, not only for the things they need to go to school and that kind of thing, but also to make a contribution. And we really talked about that with our kids. You're working now, you're making minimum wage. They got minimum wage. They were above minimum wage. Their parents were working for minimum wage. We paid our kids at that time above minimum wage. And they were going and said, you've got to contribute to your family. So when you get paid, you give your mom and dad some money and then you go buy whatever you wanted. But you always pay yourself, pay your parents, and then you play. Okay. Yeah. So there's a way to
savings,
and it's about teaching them.
And
one of the things that we did, we brought them in to learn what it means to have a checking account. But the big part of it was having them connect to the bosque, the actual bosque, and they would do clearing of down and dead for forest fires. They built benches. They did recreational and informational kiosks. If you go to the bosque today, you'll see some of the stuff that our kids built out there. Oh. And it just gave them a sense of their connection to nature. And then we kind of said, okay, now let's go back into the neighborhood and let's look around. This is the urban forest. We live in an urban forest. And what's happening in our neighborhoods? Well, the trees are dying. Well, what are we going to do about that? They had learned how to plant trees, long pole, short pole trees, and plant them in the bosque and for replacement. So we began to cultivate those. And we planted well over 1,000 trees. The kids mapped the neighborhood. They went up and down the streets with a clipboard, and they mapped every bush, every tree, which was dying, where it could be replaced. And then we set on a campaign working with Tree New Mexico. Sue Probart was the director at the time. And we began to work together to do tree giveaways. And our Bosque kids would come to the garden, open up the garden on a Saturday and a Sunday, and we invite other neighborhoods to come in and get trees. But then for the neighborhoods, the current neighbors that are living here, we show them how to plant a tree. We'd take it to their house and show them how to plant a tree. We'd have a little agreement they'd sign saying they would help take care of the tree and how much, and those are the kind of trees that if you take care of them the first year, they'll take off on their own pretty much. So we began to reforest our urban neighborhood because environmental issues. We're sat between a freeway, a lot of congestion downtown, all the neighborhood congestion to the south of us, the air quality. We said, this is important that we do this. And it just fulfills a lot of things that we wanted to do. So then later on, we kind of evolved into a charter school. USBC wrote the charter for the charter school. The Dorn Charter School, named after my parents. Our focus, we're the only charter school that was founded on the principles of anti-racism, environmental justice practices, as well as STEM, understanding the environment and the environmental justice aspects of that, which is why it was important to understand issues of race in there. So that's what the school operates as, K through 5. And we operate on that principle all the time. And now, of course, we're timely because now we have equity councils that have to be in place from the Yazzie Martinez lawsuit. We have the African American Black Education Act. We're poised to do that. And of course, United South Broadway also does the Anti-Racism Institute of the Southwest, where we do training with people across the state. We've been doing for 27, 30 years, working with People's Institute for Survival and Beyond out of Louisiana. And we put on workshops, doing workshops. We bought into their model, and we've used it with banking, having people having access, because we do housing. We got to make sure that people have access to loans, and fair and affordable loans. And so we began to look at the connection between that as well. How do we make sure that people have access to credit and capital?
Yes, credit and capital is kind of those accesses to key things here. And there's one of the programs at the charter school that I think is so great is the birding program.
Oh, yeah.
That, trying to identify the birds in the neighborhood,
and
attract them.
And bringing bees,
and butterflies and
bees,
insects.
Birds, and butterflies back into the neighborhood. The garden has done that. And it's constant. Everybody likes to start a garden. I tell them, the garden is a living, breathing thing, okay? You can't plant it and walk away. So you better have a caretaker, okay?
Yeah.
You have to have someone who is responsible for the garden, okay? Our garden is a learning garden. It's a training garden, learning garden. Kids go out there and they learn, and they document the growth of things, and they have the medicine wheel garden, and they learn about medicines and how they can, where natural medicine comes from. And we bring in people from the community, like Sylvia Ledesma from Calpuli Escali.
Right.
She comes in and works with our kids. She was a master gardener. And so we worked with her. We have a Mr. Gonzalez right now. He's a farmer. So he's teaching them a little bit differently around how they do foods and how they do preparation. In some ways, he's kind of looking at historic foods and ancient plants, and teaching them how they were prepared at one time. And so our school is probably one of the most racially diverse. It's a small school, but it's racially diverse because of where we are in the downtown core. So I just want our children to be worldly. And I think we have to start them early. You can make an impact with a child if you start early. When they get to another age, you're competing with too many other outside forces. So if you can get them on the right path, I think early on, let's face it, we know that if a child is not reading by 3rd grade, they're building a prison cell for them. That's what the research tells us. And so we've got to keep our children out of that pathway.
Right. Those young kids, they're so open to everything. They're so excited.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So Diana, I wanted to ask about the United South Broadway as an advocacy organization and does advocacy with the legislature and on all these issues that we've been talking about. So I'd like to hear some more about that.
Well, just as we said, housing is very racialized. It's also very political because it's a costly venture. Housing can be, and it takes public policy to produce affordable housing. So it's important that we stay involved from a number of reasons. First of all, we do mortgage work. Mortgage work is very complicated. If you remember, if you've ever bought a home, if you've ever recall going back when you did your closing, you had a stack of papers this thick, and there were probably 10 or 15 players that all came together over a period of time to get you in that chair to sign documents. So it's complicated. And it's important that we, as an organization that does housing, make sure that the housing market is vibrant and accessible to particularly low-income communities that are seeking access to credit and capital. And so we have always looked at lending practices. Early on, we actually looked at bank mergers that were happening in the 80s, and we had our share of those mergers here in this community.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a time when, under the Community Reinvestment Act, the Congressional Act of 1977, that says banks must lend money in their delineated service areas. So that really comes to bear when banks are being merged and purchased by other banks. What will that bank do? Will they move out? Will they close that branch? What will happen to the servicing for that community? And so that's a time when you can actually do bank challenges under the Community Reinvestment Act. And so our group would come forward, and it wasn't necessarily United South Broadway. We would come together as a coalition of different groups and individuals, and we formed something called the CARE Coalition. Now, I couldn't tell you today what that stands for, that acronym, but Community Reinvestment something, okay?
Okay.
I think it was called the Credit or CARE, one or the other. But anyway, that was the vehicle in which we began to challenge bank mergers. And when you challenge bank mergers, you can also come up with community agreements. And so always we would look, how is this bank going to put money aside for small business and for home ownership? So that's policy work. And then as you look at mortgages, well, this country had a major crash in the mortgage industry. And it was virtually around fraud in many ways, and lack of education on the part of a homeowner, understanding what they were signing and what they were being lured into. And so on the loan origination side, when you first start the process of owning a home, loan origination, we had to make sure that rates are affordable rates, that they're not predatory rates, that the practices, how they looked at the credit and qualified people, that's all called loan origination. And so we worked on the front end of that, and because there were so many abuses, we were able to come up with a law, the New Mexico Home Loan Protection Act. And we worked with Center for Responsible Lending out of North Carolina because they were expert. They'd been looking at us anyway because they had heard about us challenging these bank mergers, and they kind of have radars and look around the country. Where's a good place for us to go and put some consumer protections in place? And who has a ready market of people ready to do that? Well, we were one of them. So when we called them, it was like, yeah, we've been waiting on this call. So we were able to bring them here. It was a major movement. As a matter of fact, it closed down the legislature. The important thing is that you have a good sponsor in the Senate. It's industry bill, and basically we're saying we're gonna put a check on these lending institutions that they cannot do certain things. There was a concept called equity stripping, where they would take a home and refinance it, and they would wipe out all the equity, paying this and fees and services, and they may pay something for the homeowner, some back debt or something like that, but pretty much it just wasn't an equitable process. A lot of money was stripped out of that person's mortgage. Equity was stripped out of that loan through fees. That didn't go in their pocket. And so one of the things that came out of that was you had to have a net tangible benefit to the borrower, if you were going to refinance and start taking equity out. And that became part of the Dodd-Frank Act, the federal act that says you must have a net tangible benefit. That act stood up in a lawsuit, in a local lawsuit with the Bank of New York, if I'm not mistaken.
Right,
the Romero case, where they charged, that was one of the defenses in that case, that they did not have a net tangible benefit. And that was, it was a huge shift in the industry. And it was taking place around this country. But when it came to Albuquerque, to New Mexico, every lobbyist in the country came here. They said, this is bellwether time, okay? If this takes place in New Mexico, all heck's gonna break out. So it did take place, but it was a hard fought act. We had to do a lot of community organizing and working with a lot of groups. So it was myself, Raynell Zuni, Vanjie Gabaldon, and Vicki Plevin, 4 women that did this. And we were up in Santa Fe all the time, working with legislators, working with our sponsors, and we finally got that bill. But the day it came to a vote, it got to the Senate floor. There were not enough people to vote. Democrats had left, Republicans had left. Nobody wanted to vote on that bill. Even though they said in committees they were going to do it, we'd gone through all these little talks, and tweaked our bill and did everything we could do, and we finally had a deal when it got to the Senate floor. So what they did, our sponsor, who had a lot of clout, he shut the Senate down and did a call of the Senate. That means that he's going to do roll call. Everybody's got to be in their seat. If you're not there, then he sends the state police out to pick you up, wherever you are. You get a call,
Wow.
the state police is coming to pick you up. So we had people that were gone home for lunch. We'd had people that were teaching a class at UNM. They were just all over at their businesses. Well, they all got a little tap on the shoulder and said, "You're needed in the Senate," okay? And they got a state police ride to sit in there. They escort you literally into your chair because it's a call of the Senate. Now, naive me, we get off the elevator at the Roundhouse and everybody's pandemonium's everywhere. Like, people are screaming, hollering. And I look at my friend Vicky and said, what are they talking about? They said the Senate has closed down because of our bill.
Wow.
The senator has
High
put
drama.
a call of the Senate. It was high drama. And it was a 50-50 vote. Now that was really good. I mean, we really had a big win because we probably should have, these senators from across the state, they were not eager to take on that
board.
industry. They get a lot of money from that industry and protections. And some of them are bank board members and stuff that sit on these committees and powerful committees. And so the pressure was there because we put AARP to work. We put all these community groups across the state to call their senator, 25 calls every day. Make sure you call them, harass them about this bill. You want this bill for protection. And had a 50-50 vote. Diane Dinish, a Democrat, was the lieutenant governor. She broke the tie. And we had the Home Loan Protection Act. So it's the best thing going. We won a national award for it with Center for Responsible Lending. We made presentations in Washington, D.C. and New York City about what we did. We were trying to do payday lending at the same time during that whole legislative process.
Right.
But it was real clear to us after about we were in a long session, but after a couple of weeks, we realized this legislature is not buying this whole thing around payday lending. And the other thing is that payday lending is highly financed by a lot of people who we think wouldn't be financing it, and they are, okay? And so we said, when we would go into committees, they would say, well, really, isn't that just, that's what people need? They need access to this kind of money. Well, what happened to banks making small loans?
Right.
Banks used to make small loans, but now their predatory loans are made out of a retail storefront. But we realized we had to make a choice. And during that session, we either have to go where we feel we had some momentum, or do we keep hitting our heads against this brick wall? You know, that may be, I think one senator said something, that's the light at the end of the tunnel. I said, yeah, but it could be a freight train coming your way. And that's not the light you want to see at the end of a tunnel, okay? But so we dropped the payday movement and we focused strictly on mortgage lending, the mortgage process. And we were able to really bring a piece of legislation that stands to this day. So it doesn't matter what kind of mortgage instrument you use, because mortgages are initiated all over the country. They're for New Mexico. They're initiated in other parts of the country because the underwriting is taking place and banks are so out there in different mortgage companies.
Yeah,
but if it is
anymore.
in New Mexico, it doesn't matter whether you use a deed of trust or a traditional mortgage. The bottom of that document, there's a legend that says, in the case of New Mexico, you will use the Home Loan Protection Act. That's the process. So in New Mexico, we have a due process. We have a judicial process for foreclosure. Not every state has that. That means that you cannot have your home taken away from you unless you have a day in court. But that also means that the bank's gonna sue you, okay? They're gonna come and serve you with papers, and you're gonna have to respond in 30 days with an answer to that. And so that you can weigh in and say, that's my property, and I need to know everything that's going on with it while it's going through that process. Well, then we saw, well, how are people, this is great. How are people gonna, do when they get served? Because we were doing housing counseling. And we were doing a presentation one day, and an attorney, Mr. Eddie Benavides, he heard our presentation about banking. And he came up to us afterwards and said, you guys have any attorneys? We said, no. He said, well, I just got put on a commission for the Civil Legal Service Commission. Here's the RFP, write it and turn it in by such and such time. And we did. And we've had legal services to offer homeowners since 2004. So we've created this one-stop shop for foreclosure defense. And because we were the only one doing it, so our organization did a lot of things around housing before. Our housing work is pretty much steeped in foreclosure defense.
Right.
Those kind of consumer
Okay.
protections.
So that's
we
how
have
that
a
evolved.
one-stop shop for housing counseling as well as legal defense for people who are income eligible. And we have worked with the courts to come up with mediation programs so that homeowners can have a chance to negotiate even deeper around keeping their homes. Because keeping a home in New Mexico is good for New Mexico. That's a tax base.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also a just thing to do because we have a lot of low-income tax homeowners in New Mexico per capita than other states. That could really have let's face it, where do we fall in poverty on the ranking? We're always in the bottom 5 in terms of rates of poverty. And if we were to lose homes for low income, for people who are considered in poverty, if they were to lose their home, what would happen to our state? It even would be a more dire situation.
Yeah.
So we believe that we have to save.
51.
Yeah, we have to save homes wherever we can, and keep people out of the ranks of the homeless. So policy work is important. And then we went on to start looking at broker work, how brokers operate, because the banking industry began to change. You don't go to your local bank to get a loan anymore. There's a broker out there, you know?
Right.
And they broker your loan around, okay? So
could be anyone.
And some people were doing it in the back of their cars, as we know, that they had broker business in the back of their trunk of their car, working out in the parking lot of Walmart or something, and taking applications and that kind of stuff, and abuses. And so we had to work with the state of New Mexico to begin to put constraints and protections in place, laws in place to, again, protect the consumer.
So that was the Loan Origination Licensing Act. They had to conform to, there had to be some standards
about how they were going to
how that
operate
was
and how
done.
they would disclose to homeowners, and conduct their businesses and be licensed. How about that?
Yeah, everyone else has to be licensed no matter what.
As a nonprofit, we got to have a license, so to speak, right?
Right, we do. So certainly mortgage brokers, since they're handling such huge transactions.
An important asset to families.
So that's how we've ended up in the work that all of us are doing right now, which is trying to keep people in their homes, save homes,
and being responsive to the needs of community people as they see them and as they articulate them. So someone could walk in the door today from this neighborhood or other neighborhood around here and say, this is a problem that me and my neighbors and others are experiencing, and we're obligated, in my opinion, to at least look into it and say, yeah, it is a legitimate problem. How do we work together to resolve this issue? Or let me just tell you more about how this works. And so they have a better understanding. So because we've been given a privileged space in this neighborhood, I think we have a voice, and even from a neighborhood standpoint, our organization can convene meetings just like any other neighborhood association, maybe even broader, because our tentacles go much further than just South Broadway. So it's rewarding work, it's challenging, but we have a huge level of responsibility, I think, in terms of our responsibility to being responsive to community needs. So I like to say we're kind of organic. We move and change as the need becomes necessary, but at the same time, keeping a deep understanding of what our capacity is. So it shouldn't be, we're doing this today and tomorrow we're going to go do this. It should be a natural progression. And if we're doing our work right, it is a natural progression.
And it's all centered around neighborhoods and housing. There is a coherence.
Yeah, and I like to use the term neighborhood because that's that smaller component. When we go, then we become the community, and then it goes broader. But there is that thing of working neighborhood by neighborhood that starts to build to a community picture.
Well, thank you, Diana. This has been a great education. And is there anything else you'd like to add before we close? That's pretty much what I had.
No, I think the biggest challenge we always have is, and it's not really a challenge. I guess we're in some way it's a blessing because people that come to work for United South Broadway tend to be attracted to what we do. So it's not because I just got to make a living. Yes, I can make a living, but at the same time I can fulfill my own personal commitment to doing social kind of work and giving a contribution to the community. And those are the type of people that tend to attract to United South Broadway, which makes my life so much easier.